The world had never seen destruction on this scale before. Between 1914 and 1918, more than 70 million soldiers marched into battle. By the time the guns fell silent, over 20 million people were dead, men, women, and children, lost to a war that consumed continents. Cities were reduced to rubble, empires that had stood for centuries crumbled overnight, and a generation of youth vanished in the smoke of artillery and the mud of the trenches. This was not a single nation's tragedy, it was humanity's. Europe, once the center of progress, art, and science, had turned into a colossal battlefield. Nations that had shared trade and culture for decades now fought each other with machine guns, poison gas, and tanks, the terrifying new faces of industrial warfare. From the skies above France to the deserts of Arabia, the earth itself seemed to bleed. In London, bells that once rang for peace tolled for the dead. In Berlin and Paris, families waited by the door, hoping their sons might still return. The world's great powers, Britain, France, Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, were locked in a struggle so vast that even distant nations like Japan, India, and the United States would be pulled into its grip. But how did it begin? How did a single gunshot in Sarajevo trigger the most devastating conflict the world had ever witnessed? The answer lies not in one event, but in years of rivalry, pride, and ambition. The First World War was more than a fight for territory. It was the collapse of an old world order. And in its ashes, a new, more dangerous one would rise. This is the story of World War I, the war that changed everything. At the dawn of the 20th century, Europe stood proud, powerful, industrialized, and brimming with confidence. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity, the continent was a ticking time bomb. Rival empires competed for colonies, armies swelled in size, and leaders played a dangerous game of pride and paranoia. The peace that seemed unshakable was, in truth, held together by fear. The great powers of Europe were bound by a tangled web of alliances, meant to guarantee security, but in reality they guaranteed war. On one side stood the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. On the other, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Each nation promised to defend the others, creating a chain reaction waiting for just one spark to ignite. Germany, young and ambitious, sought its place in the sun. Its rapid industrial growth and military buildup challenged Britain's naval dominance and France's pride. Across the continent, nationalism burned fiercely. Serbs dreamed of uniting Slavic lands under one flag, Poles sought freedom from empire, and ethnic tensions pulled at the seams of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman realms. Meanwhile, Europe's leaders glorified war as a test of honor. Newspapers spoke of victory, not of death. Children played with toy soldiers, and generals prepared battle plans like chess masters. Few realized how deadly modern war had become. Machine guns, artillery, and chemical weapons were ready, products of an industrial age now pointed at humanity itself. And then, in June 1914, the fuse was lit. In a quiet corner of the Balkans, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo. That single bullet tore through more than one man. It shattered the fragile peace of Europe. Within weeks, the alliances that were meant to protect nations dragged them all into a catastrophe no one could stop. The world was about to learn how quickly pride, politics, and power could turn civilization into chaos. The summer of 1914 began with confidence and celebration. Across Europe, the mood was electric. Flags waved, anthems roared, and young men volunteered eagerly, believing they would be home by Christmas. No one imagined that the coming months would plunge the world into one of the darkest chapters in human history. What began as a political crisis in the Balkans quickly spiraled into a global catastrophe. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Austria-Hungary issued a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia agreed to most of the demands, but not all, and that small hesitation was enough. Backed by Germany, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914. Within days, the web of alliances turned the conflict into a chain reaction. Russia, bound by Slavic loyalty and its alliance with Serbia, began to mobilize. Germany saw this as an act of aggression and declared war on Russia on August 1st, and 2 days later, on France, Russia's ally. To strike France quickly before Russia could fully mobilize, Germany launched the Schlieffen Plan, a massive invasion through neutral Belgium, designed to encircle and crush French forces within weeks. But the invasion of Belgium changed everything. Belgium's small army fought bravely, slowing the German advance, while reports of atrocities against civilians shocked the world. Britain, bound by treaty to protect Belgian neutrality, issued an ultimatum to Germany. When it was ignored, Britain declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914. In less than a week, Europe's strongest nations had all declared war. The dominoes had fallen. The early battles were brutal and swift. German forces advanced rapidly across Belgium and into northern France, driving back French and British troops. It seemed as though Paris itself would soon fall. But in early September, at the Battle of the Marne, French and British soldiers launched a desperate counterattack along the Marne River. Against all odds, they halted the German advance. Exhausted and unable to push forward, both sides began digging trenches for protection, a grim network of mud, barbed wire, and death that stretched hundreds of miles from the North Sea to Switzerland. While the Western Front sank into stalemate, the Eastern Front exploded in chaos. The Russian army, enormous but poorly coordinated, invaded East Prussia. At Tannenberg, German commanders Hindenburg and Ludendorff encircled and destroyed a Russian army twice their size. Over 90,000 Russians were captured and tens of thousands more killed. By the end of 1914, millions were dead or wounded. The fields of Europe were scarred, entire towns destroyed, and yet no one was any closer to victory. The optimism of summer had vanished, replaced by the grim realization that this war, the war to end all wars, had only just begun. By the winter of 1914, the war had frozen into a terrible stillness. The great offensives had failed, and from the North Sea to the Swiss border, soldiers faced each other across a wasteland of mud, wire, and death. The trenches became their world, cold, wet, and suffocating. What was meant to be a temporary defense turned into a vast underground city of misery. Each army dug deep ditches, reinforced with sandbags and wood, stretching for hundreds of miles. Between them lay a narrow strip of land filled with craters, shattered trees, and the dead. It was called No Man's Land, because no man could survive there for long. Soldiers lived under constant bombardment. Day and night, artillery shells rained down, shaking the earth and filling the air with dirt and smoke. The sound was unending, a thunder that never stopped. Inside the trenches, life was almost unbearable. Mud swallowed boots, rats fed on the dead, and lice crawled in uniforms. The smell of rot, sweat, and gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Food arrived cold, letters from home became lifelines, and every dawn brought the fear of another attack. Men slept sitting up, rifles always within reach, waiting for the order to go over the top. And when that order came, few returned. Between the lines, no man's land was a nightmare. It stretched only a few hundred meters, but crossing it meant running through machine gun fire, tangled wire, and exploding shells. Thousands died for a few yards of ground. On quiet nights, soldiers could hear the enemy talking or coughing from across the field. Sometimes, during brief ceasefires, men from both sides crawled out to rescue the wounded or bury the dead. In those moments, enemies became just men, tired, frightened, and human. As the war dragged on, science turned even darker. In 1915, Germany unleashed a new terror, poison gas. Clouds of chlorine rolled across the trenches, burning lungs and blinding eyes. Soon every army used it, mustard gas, phosgene, and other horrors. Soldiers wore crude masks, but many still died in agony, coughing and choking in the mud. The air itself had become a weapon. The human cost was beyond imagination. Millions were wounded, many losing limbs or faces. Others returned home broken in mind, haunted by the screams of battle. This was not the heroic war poets had promised. It was a living hell made by modern machines. Yet, amid the chaos, there was courage. Soldiers shared their rations, letters, and fears. They built friendships stronger than fear itself. In the midst of death, they clung to small acts of humanity: a shared cigarette, a song in the dark, a memory of home. The First World War was not just fought in fields and trenches, it was fought inside the hearts of those who endured it. The trenches became a graveyard of innocence, where bravery and suffering existed side by side, and where an entire generation learned the true price of war. As the war deepened, the flames of conflict spread far beyond the fields of Europe. What began as a struggle among European empires quickly grew into a truly global war, pulling nations and colonies from every corner of the world into its grasp. Millions who had never seen Europe would soon fight and die for it. In late 1914, the Ottoman Empire, once mighty, now struggling to survive, joined the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The decision opened new fronts across the Middle East, the Caucasus, and North Africa. The Ottoman sultans, guided by German advisors, believed victory could restore their fading empire. But their entry also brought unimaginable suffering to their people. The war would tear through ancient lands, across deserts, mountains, and holy cities. The Allies, seeking to break through to Russia and knock the Ottomans out of the war, launched one of the most daring and tragic operations of the entire conflict: the Gallipoli Campaign of 1915. British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops landed on the Turkish coast, facing fierce resistance. What was supposed to be a quick victory turned into months of bloodshed. The beaches and cliffs of Gallipoli became killing grounds, and by the end, over 500,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. The campaign failed, but it forged legends, particularly for the young nations of Australia and New Zealand, whose soldiers, known as Anzacs, fought with incredible bravery. Gallipoli became their story of identity, born in sacrifice. Meanwhile, battles raged across Africa and the Middle East. In Africa, colonial troops, many of them from India and across the British Empire, fought under foreign flags for causes they barely understood. In the Middle East, the war took on a new face: desert warfare. British officer T. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, helped lead an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, promising freedom that would later be betrayed by politics and empire. The sands of Arabia, once untouched by Europe's rivalries, now echoed with explosions and the cries of war. India, still under British rule, played a massive yet often forgotten role. Over 1.3 million Indian soldiers served overseas, in France, Mesopotamia, East Africa, and Gallipoli. They fought in freezing trenches and scorching deserts, winning medals for courage yet receiving little recognition. Their sacrifices helped shape the growing desire for independence back home. From Canada to South Africa, from Egypt to Japan, the war's reach was unmatched. It was no longer just Europe's conflict, it was the world's. Ships clashed in distant seas, African villages burned, and Asian ports became supply lines. By 1916, every continent except Antarctica had been touched by the war's destruction. This was the moment the world truly became one battlefield. The First World War was not confined to maps or borders. It was a storm that swept across humanity itself, changing nations, rewriting empires, and proving that no corner of the earth could escape the violence unleashed by modern war. By 1917, the war had dragged on for 3 long years, and exhaustion hung over every nation like a heavy fog. Millions were dead, millions more wounded, and yet no side had gained a decisive advantage. The trenches were filled with despair, the economies were collapsing, and the spirit that had once fueled the war was fading fast. Across Europe, hunger, anger, and hopelessness began to replace patriotism. and in the East, that frustration exploded into revolution. In Russia, the people had endured unbearable losses. Soldiers fought without proper weapons, peasants starved, and the Tsar's government seemed blind to the suffering. Protests turned into riots, and in early 1917, the centuries-old Romanov dynasty fell. The Tsar abdicated, and a provisional government took power, but it made a fatal mistake. It kept Russia in the war. The soldiers, already broken and weary, refused to fight any longer. By the end of the year, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized control, promising peace and bread to the people. True to his word, Lenin withdrew Russia from the war, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in early 1918. The Eastern Front fell silent, freeing German troops to fight in the West, but it was already too late for victory. Across the Atlantic, another power was awakening. The United States, which had remained neutral since 1914, watched as the war dragged on. But Germany's decision to use unrestricted submarine warfare changed everything. German U-boats prowled the seas, sinking not only military vessels but also neutral and civilian ships. The most infamous incident came in 1915 when the British liner Lusitania was torpedoed, killing over 1,000 people, including 128 Americans. Outrage grew, and when Germany resumed full-scale submarine attacks in 1917, combined with the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German proposal encouraging Mexico to attack the U.S., President Woodrow Wilson declared war on Germany. America's entry into the conflict transformed it. The U.S. brought fresh troops, supplies, and hope to the exhausted Allies. The doughboys, as the American soldiers were called, began arriving in France in 1918, and their presence tipped the balance of power. For the first time in years, the Allies had both the strength and the spirit to push forward. Meanwhile, the nature of war itself was changing. The battlefield had become a laboratory of innovation. Tanks rolled across the mud, breaking through barbed wire and crushing enemy lines. Aircraft, once used only for scouting, now carried bombs and machine guns, turning the skies into a new dimension of combat. Machine guns, flamethrowers, and heavy artillery made every advance costly, but the new technologies hinted at a future where wars would be fought not just by men, but by machines. By mid-1918, the old world had collapsed. Monarchies had fallen, revolutions had begun, and new powers had risen. What started as a European conflict was now a global transformation. The war had become not only a struggle for victory but a battle for the future of civilization itself. By early 1918, the war had reached its breaking point. After Russia's withdrawal, Germany saw one last chance to win before American forces arrived in full strength. Gathering nearly every available soldier from the Eastern Front, the German High Command launched a massive assault on the Western Front, the Spring Offensive. It was their final gamble, a desperate push to end the war on their terms. In March 1918, the German army struck with terrifying force. Artillery rained down across the Allied lines, followed by stormtrooper units, elite soldiers trained to move fast and strike deep. For the first time in years, the stalemate broke. German troops surged forward, advancing nearly 40 miles and threatening Paris itself. The Allies were stunned. Panic spread through their ranks as towns fell and the front seemed ready to collapse. But this success came at a terrible cost. Germany had thrown everything it had into the offensive: men, weapons, and hope, and there were no reserves left to replace the fallen. Exhaustion and hunger haunted their soldiers. The Empire's resources were drained, and the civilians back home were starving under the weight of a collapsing economy and a devastating blockade. Then, the tide began to turn. By the summer of 1918, the Allies, reinforced by fresh American troops, regrouped and counterattacked. The Second Battle of the Marne became the turning point. Allied forces pushed the Germans back, inch by inch, through the ruins of France and Belgium. The newly arrived Americans, full of energy and determination, played a crucial role, giving the Allies strength that Germany could no longer match. The front that Germany had gained with such speed now crumbled under relentless pressure. By the autumn, German soldiers were retreating everywhere. Their allies, the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria, had all collapsed. At home, revolutions erupted as the German people, starving and weary, demanded peace. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled into exile. The once mighty German Empire was in ruins. On November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice was signed. The guns finally fell silent. Soldiers who had survived the horrors of the trenches stood in stunned quiet, unable to grasp that it was truly over. Across Europe, church bells rang, but the sound was hollow. There was no victory, only relief. The cost was unimaginable. More than 20 million people were dead, soldiers, civilians, and the countless who perished from famine and disease. Entire cities lay in ruins. Fields once filled with crops were now graveyards. Millions more were left scarred, blinded, or broken in spirit. The war had redrawn maps, destroyed empires, and shattered faith in progress and humanity itself. When the guns fell silent, the world was forever changed. When the echoes of gunfire faded in 1918, Europe stood in ruins. The war that was meant to end all wars had instead destroyed everything it touched: nations, empires, and faith in humanity itself. Yet even in peace, the world could not escape the shadow of the Great War. The years that followed were not marked by healing, but by blame, bitterness, and unfinished grief. In 1919, leaders from the victorious nations gathered in France to shape the new world order. The result was the Treaty of Versailles, signed inside the glittering Hall of Mirrors, the same place where Germany had once declared its empire in 1871. Now it was there to be humiliated. The treaty placed full blame for the war on Germany and its allies. It demanded enormous reparations, billions in payments, and stripped Germany of its colonies, much of its army, and its pride. German territories were divided, its economy strangled, and its people left in despair. The treaty may have ended the war on paper, but in truth it planted the seeds of another, far greater conflict. A young generation in Germany would grow up angry, humiliated, and ready to follow anyone who promised revenge. While Germany faced punishment, the great empires that had ruled for centuries simply vanished. The Austro-Hungarian Empire broke apart into a patchwork of new nations: Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire, once the heart of Islam's power, was carved up by the Allies, giving birth to modern Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. The Russian Empire, already shattered by revolution, descended into civil war between the Reds and White. Across continents, borders were redrawn by diplomats who barely understood the lands they were dividing. The human cost was far deeper than geography. Entire generations were missing: sons, fathers, brothers who would never return. In towns and villages across Europe, every family had a grave to mourn. Survivors carried invisible wounds, shattered nerves, sleepless nights, and a silence that haunted them for life. The term shell shock entered the world's vocabulary, a name for the psychological scars no one yet understood. Men who had faced constant bombardment and death came home unable to speak of what they had seen. Some could not adjust to peace, others never truly left the trenches in their minds. The Great War also changed how people saw civilization itself. The same science and industry that had promised progress had instead created machines of mass death. Faith in governments, in empires, in reason, all of it had cracked. Art, literature, and philosophy turned dark, cynical, and disillusioned. The world realized that progress had a cost, and that humanity's greatest threat was not ignorance, but itself. The First World War ended empires and created new nations, but it also left behind anger, grief, and vengeance. And in that anger lay the quiet beginnings of a new storm, one that would rise only 20 years later and set the world on fire once again.